Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our ongoing podcast series, The Perils Facing the African Continent. In our previous episode, we discussed the haunting legacy of the slave trade, what was called the transatlantic slave trade, which was branded as the worst case of human trafficking ever recorded in world history. In that episode, to enable understand what, when, and where things started going wrong for Africa, we underscored that the arrival of the Europeans about the 15th century, followed closely by that of slave trade, were the first in a series of historical tragedies faced by the African continent and its people. Today, we delve into yet another dark chapter in African history, that of European colonization and imperialism in Africa. As we transition to today's episode, allow me to briefly engage the reasons why slave trade, which paved way for colonization of Africa, was abolished. Historian Eric Williams, in his book, Capitalism and Slavery, 1944, argued that slavery was abolished not because it was morally wrong, but because it had become economically obsolete. Another scholar, Hochschild, in 2005, gave several reasons why the slave trade ended. First, the abolitionist movements led by figures such as William Wilberforce, supported by groups like the Quakers, played a crucial role in shifting public opinion and pressuring governments to act, I believe, in Europe. Second, and a more substantive reason, is the economic transformations taking place in Europe during the Industrial Revolution, which made slave labor less essential, as factory-based economies favored wage labor. Third and final reason, the persistent slave rebellions, such as the Haitian Revolution, that was 1791 to 1804, which led to the independence of Republic of Haiti and considered the first successful large-scale revolt by enslaved people against colonial rule, which exposed the dangers and instability of slavery. As we connect slave trade with colonization, we can therefore conclude that the abolition of slave trade was not humanitarian, nor it did not end European exploitation of Africa. It simply transformed its mechanism, whereby Africans who were once taken away as slaves across the Atlantic under colonization were now being subjected to exploitation and forced labor within their own lands under European colonial rule. Now we move to colonization and imperialism in Africa. I want to begin by saying that during the build-up to colonization, this is between the 1800s and 1880s, Europe had begun the shift of its focus to resource extraction and direct territorial control. This period was a transitional phase where European powers sought new markets for their goods and raw materials for their industrialization. According to scholar Martin Meredith, in his book, The State of Africa, 2005, I quote, "By 1870s, it was clear to European powers that the continent's economic potential," I think he's referring to Europe in this case, "could not be fully harnessed through trade alone, but it required occupation." This is occupation of the continent of Africa, among other spaces in the world. The European occupation of Africa was forceful, done through a combination of military conquest, deceitful diplomacy, economic manipulation, and exploitative treaties that undermined African sovereignty. Across Africa, as colonization took root, wars were common. A few examples: the Xhosa Wars, 1779 to 1879 in South Africa, the Anglo-Ashanti Wars, 1823-1900, in what is today modern-day Ghana, reflected the mounting tension as imperial powers pushed inland. Another critical one, a changing point, is the Boer Wars, the first and second, first being 1880-81, second 1899-1902. This was unique because it pitted the British and the Dutch settlers, who were termed the Boers, in South Africa, further signaling the geopolitical importance of controlling mineral-rich territories like the Transvaal in South Africa, known for its gold and diamonds. The above dynamics led to a pivotal moment where German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck convened the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, primarily to prevent inter-European conflict over African territories, but also to carve out the African continent among the European powers. Not a single African delegate was present at the conference, which formalized the Scramble for Africa that carved up 90% of the continent among the European powers sitting at that table by 1800. Thomas Pakenham, in his book, The Scramble for Africa, 1991, states that, I quote, "The map of Africa was transformed in just 20 years from a largely indigenous political patchwork into one dominated by European lines of control." The rationale for occupation was strategic and economic, as Africa offered a wealth of untapped natural resources, including rubber and minerals from the Congo, cotton from Egypt, palm oil from Nigeria, and strategic maritime positions like that of the Suez Canal on the Red Sea. The British, for instance, saw the control of Egypt as early as 1882 as essential for their route to India. India was later termed as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Another area of interest to you viewers is that the period immediately after the Berlin Conference saw the rise of colonial chartered companies, which were relied on as instruments of imperial expansion, economic exploitation, and indirect governance across Africa. The companies, such as the Imperial British East Africa Company in Kenya and Uganda, the Royal Niger Company in Nigeria, the British South African Company in Zimbabwe and Zambia, the German East African Company in Tanganyika those days, were not merely commercial enterprises, but de facto colonial governments empowered by royal charters to conquer, tax, police, and administer vast territories. Historian T.O. Rangers notes in his book, The Invention of Tradition in Colonial Africa, 1983, states that these companies functioned as proto-states, exercising sovereign powers without accountability or consent of the governed. For instance, the Imperial British East African Company, founded in 1888 under Sir William Mackinnon, imposed taxes, signed coercive treaties, maintained private militias, and constructed infrastructure solely for the export of raw materials. As Susan Martin, another scholar, writes, The Corporation as Empire, 2003, she states that these companies operated with, I quote, a fusion of corporate greed and imperial authority, systematically dismantling African political economies and replacing them with extractive structures tailored to European needs. I wish to briefly engage the nature of colonial rule. During the colonial era, the violence meted against the African people were genocidal in nature. European powers overwhelmed African resistance with brutal force. They were armed with superior weaponry and driven by imperial ideologies. An example is battle such as that of Omdurman in Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, 1898, where, according to Winston Churchill, more than 11,000 Sudanese were killed, 13,000 wounded, and about 5,000 captured, compared to just 48 British troops. In Namibia, then German Southwest Africa, between 1904 and 1907, the Herero and Nama people were systematically exterminated, where up to 80% of the Herero died and some 65,000 victims were killed or starved in camps. French forces in Algeria perpetrated scorched earth campaigns, killing an estimated 1 million Algerians, about 1/3 of the population, through massacres, famine, and chemical warfare. In the Congo Free State, under King Leopold II, forced labor, starvation, killings caused population decline. Hochschild, who we referred to earlier, estimates the deaths in the Congo to about 10 million people. Across Kenya, Congo, Algeria, South Africa, and Namibia, fertile lands were seized to serve colonial and settler interests. In South Africa, the 1913 Native Land Act formalized a system that set aside 13%, and I want to emphasize only 13% of land for the black majority. The other 87% was reserved for the white minority, forcing people into crowded reserves. In Kenya, the White Highlands, where the British authorities evicted over 60,000 Africans, this built up to 1939, relocating them into reserves or enclosed villages to pave way for European settlers. Scholars like Thabita Kanogo, her book, Squatters and the Roots of Mau Mau, 1987, and a famous scholar, Bethuel Ogot, have written extensively on the impact of land alienation during this period in history. Several Kenyan communities were displaced during the implementation of the policy on White Highlands. The Kikuyu were the most affected, losing large tracts of fertile land in central Kenya, that's Kiambu, Nyeri, and Murang'a, and were forced into labor or overcrowded reserves, while the Maasai were pushed out of their expansive grazing lands in the Rift Valley and Laikipia through the 1904 and 1911 Anglo-Maasai agreements, which relocated them to southern reserves like Ngong and Loitoktok. The Kalenjin-speaking groups, such as the Nandi and Kipsigis, as well as the neighboring Kisii or the Abagusi, also experienced extensive land alienation. To deeply appreciate the predatory nature of the 80 years of colonization of Africa, I suggest you read books by historian Mahmoud Mamdani, like Citizen and Subject, 1996, Frantz Fanon, the book The Wretched of the Earth, 1961, and Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, 1972, among many other literature on the impact of colonization. But I wish to emphasize the fact that the long-term consequences of colonial rule reshaped African societies in ways that continue to affect the continent's ecological, economic, and social fabric. Most African states inherited economies designed for European profit, not African self-reliance. Education systems are still centered on European ideals or ideas. Legal frameworks remain colonial. Bureaucracies built to serve colonial interests were in most cases left intact through independence. The legacy is therefore clear. Colonialism transformed African structures, leaving societies fragmented, landless, and ruled through foreign legal and economic templates. It's time to ask, do we understand these scars well enough to genuinely address their after effects on states in Africa today? That is the question I will leave with you to ponder. To conclude this episode, I want to again emphasize that colonization in Africa was not a passing historical phase. It was a deliberate and violent re-engineering of entire civilizations, economics, and psyche of societies. It left behind more than broken nations and implanted systems designed to fracture identity, suppress agency, and serve external masters. Today's poverty, political instability, and institutional fragility across the continent are not accidental. They are the logical outcomes of colonial design that we continue to suffer even today. As we confront these truths, the question is no longer whether colonialism was evil, but whether we have truly understood its depth and dismantled its enduring architecture. Can we build a future without confronting the skeletons buried in colonial vaults? That's a key question. Another question is, can Africa redefine itself on its own terms, or will it remain tethered to a blueprint never meant for its liberation? Thus, the legacy of colonization is not just a historical wound, it is a living reality for those of us who are in Africa today. Finally, if you found value in this episode, let's keep the conversation alive. If you are new to our podcast series, please subscribe. We need your attention, and let's like and follow the channel so you never miss an episode as we continue to uncover and relearn issues affecting our great continent. In the next episode, we'll explore the struggles of independence in Africa. Thank you.